Okay, so welcome back. This is Mr. Brown once more, and I am talking today about IB English A, Language and Literature, and I've just started a new year with my Year 12s, and we've been looking at trying to put together some of the IB's big ideas for Language A. To start with, we've covered in the course guide, we've looked at the course concepts, and I'm not going to go through each one of them now exactly, but you should, hopefully, if you've been studying English A for the last few weeks, looked at the concepts of the course. These are the big ideas, and they are going to help us to relate what is in our text, literary and non-literary text, to ourselves and the world around us by looking at big concepts of literature and language, things like identity and how we are shaped by language, how our understanding of identity is shaped by texts such as literary and non-literary text. And hopefully you've gone through all these. I should probably do a video on them on their own, but for today we're not going to be going through them all. Hopefully you've already looked at them as my Year 12s have at the moment. We've also looked at the global issues and the fields of inquiry, thinking ahead towards our individual oral, which this is particularly or directly really required for. But it is also coming up in all of our study of literature, I would say. Whatever text we're looking at, literary and non-literary, we're looking at things like culture, identity, and community, and probably this is the big one because a lot of us are looking at issues of family, class, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, gender, sexuality, big concepts that come into literature and non-literary text. And maybe a lot of you are having a focus on colonization, which this year I haven't really focused on yet, but could likely come up at some stage. Beliefs, values, and education. We've started with the text Persepolis, which deals with a couple of these very much directly, but all texts. And I've always found it very important to look at values and attitudes and trying to understand how our responses are being shaped because of values and attitudes. And I think so that's a very big field of inquiry to look at. Also, power, politics, and justice, fascinating stuff when you start to get into it. And we're looking at how language and power work together. And politics uses language in order to not only communicate, but to shape people's opinions. And the idea of justice comes up in many works of literature and non-literary text. So fascinating stuff to look at. Also, arts, creativity, and imagination. We are dealing with a lot of literature, which is an art, and we look at how authors use creativity in order to shape thoughts and feelings and imagination as well. And yeah, very important. This one comes up in a lot of my theory of knowledge discussions. And if we are really getting meta cognitive about our study of literature, a lot of our thoughts need to think about how do we build our knowledge, and a lot of it comes through imagination and emotion. And so very interesting stuff for us to consider. Science, technology, and environment, not one that comes up in the literature that I traditionally study in class, but obviously some of you could be studying some great works of science fiction, and so obviously that's going to work into it as well. And beyond that, we've also looked at areas of exploration. We haven't gone into it too explicitly, but we kind of know that we are studying text and we're looking at how readers read text, writers create text, and what the texts mean and how they operate. So that's kind of what we do all the time with both literary and non-literary text. We're always looking at time and space, putting a text into context and all of the important considerations because of that. And we are also starting to look at intertextuality, obviously, with the individual oral being an intertextual assessment, as well as paper two being very, well, absolutely an intertextual assessment. But we're always looking at how texts work alongside other texts to present shared ideas, and also how all these texts fit together to be the textuality of global literature. Interesting things. But my question to my students, particularly, is how do we do all of this together? What's the IB looking for us to do? And I asked my students to do a quick commentary. We're looking at Persepolis and try to practice using all of these things. And it was quite clear that we weren't quite ready. So what I've done is I've looked at putting together a commentary on chapter 1 of Persepolis and trying to use all of these things, particularly looking at how do we put the text into context? So looking at the readers, writers, and text, and time and space, putting it into the place of Marjan Satrapi's story and the story of Iran and Iranian history. And also, how do we talk about all of these concepts? And how do we bring our discussion of concepts into our analysis of text and do it in a natural and concise way? Something that my students are not quite getting, so kind of spurred me on to do this. And then also looking at how do we bring fields of inquiry into our thought and our study of literary and non-literary texts. So how do we put it all together? This commentary is not exactly an IO commentary. It's not exactly a paper 1 commentary. It's not exactly a paper 2 commentary. It's very much just let's study the text, let's analyze it, put the ideas together in a concise way. That combines everything. So I know that this may be very difficult for my students. You may not think that this is of great value putting it all together, but I think if we want to be big time players and aim for those higher scores, being able to get synthesis and putting them all together allows us to achieve a very high level of sophistication when we study literary and non-literary texts. Persepolis is an interesting text actually because you could study parts of it as a non-literary text, but I think the whole you would study as a literary text. So there is some crossover there. But anyway, chapter 1, it's called The Veil if you're studying it, which many IB students are. Hopefully you find this interesting and maybe helpful. So my commentary starts with Marjan Satrapi begins Persepolis with The Veil, a chapter that sets up the whole memoir's central conflict, the tension between personal identity and cultural identity. And I think that is central. A lot of my students on their own didn't really spot that as the key idea that's going on. The story is a coming of age story of the protagonist, Margie, as she grows up and builds her identity, goes through all the struggles of building identity, but at the same time living in Iran, which is going through a moment of huge shift in terms of cultural identity. And we can see the concepts of identity and culture very clearly central at the moment. And we're kind of right in the field of inquiry of cultural identity and community as the individual trying to find their place in the wider community is not just part of this text, but many texts you're going to study looking at identity, culture, community, really central stuff. And if we're looking at Satrapi's great work of literature and treating it as such and looking at the exposition in chapter 1, this is what she's doing. It's the big thing that's going on. It's her personal identity amidst all the chaos of a transforming cultural identity. Could bring in another concept there as well. On the surface, it's about the Iranian Revolution, forcing girls to wear the veil. But underneath, it's about a child trying to grow up where society itself is being transformed by religion, politics, and power. So you can see, I hope, I'm not going to stop every second now and talk about it, but hopefully you can see how we can put the concepts in nice and naturally. These are big ideas that don't need to be defined every time, but we can bring them in. And we can literally bring in our fields of inquiry and just talk about them as big things that are worth talking about. It takes it from simple, smaller discussions of moments in a text into big discussions of what's going on in the world. The graphic memoir format matters here. Satrapi's stark black and white drawings, her irony and her fragmented panels remind us this isn't just a record of events. It's about representation and perspective, how we see culture and whose version of events we trust. Okay, so all of these concepts working together, our areas of exploration being really explicit in our analysis here, and it is coming together. Hopefully you're seeing that. Take the opening images, children playing with the veil, pulling it over their faces. What the state wants as a symbol of faith and unity becomes for them a toy. That irony exposes the gap between official representation and lived identity. Okay, so very big ideas coming through. But if you're tracking what this commentary is doing, our central idea that Satrapi is bringing up is individual identity within the cultural identity of a place. And then we're tracking how that is building to questions of power and politics and questions of culture and community. And then we're looking at how is it being communicated through this, through our text and through our readers and writers medium, through the different techniques being used by the graphic novel. And this is how you talk about it all together in quite a sophisticated way. So we read this one. The irony exposes the gap between official representation and lived identity. When Satrapi says, "This is me when I was 10 years old," we hear two voices, the child in the story and the adult narrator reflecting back. The layering of perspectives shows identity as something constantly retold and reshaped across time and space. So looking at that, and that was something that came up in our class discussions about a character representing a voice in a time, but knowing that the actual author is someone on the outside shaping this younger voice was something quite interesting to look at. Why is it shows us authors' intention, and it shows us the author crafting things exactly how they want them to come across to give you a message about what happened. And the idea of different perspectives in this society, the idea of politically charged representations in this society should be coming through very strongly. And in the final panel, it's one of the early pages, one of the final panels on the page, rows of veiled, identical children erase individuality. Yet Margie's narration, "I really didn't know what to think," insists on uncertainty, resisting conformity. So very interesting, the idea of the individual identity trying to be conformed by the state, and the idea that resistance is still there. That is very much key to what the author is trying to say. So, what does this chapter really do? It shows that growing up isn't just about discovering yourself, but negotiating with the roles society pushes on you. The veil becomes a symbol of that negotiation, both belonging and erasure, both culture and control. So, this is what I keep telling my classes last year and this year. When you zoom out, you take things, all the little detail away. What's the big picture thing? And this is bringing it all together as a big picture thing. Personal identity versus the big cultural identity, and how we negotiate roles in society. And the veil becomes a symbol of that. That's big picture. That's the name of chapter one. Chapter one becomes the exposition of the big ideas that are going to come. Very important that we keep big picture ideas. The bigger global question is this: who gets to define identity, and how is that identity represented in politics, in culture, in media? That's not just Iran's story. That's a question for all of us. Say literature becomes important then. This is also part of that intertextuality. This is part of the text, not just of Persepolis, but it's the text that's shaping our lives. And I brought up in class the idea of these are things that are happening not just in this text in a radical part of the world. It's happening in my home country of Australia. And I read this through the news, and I see conflicting voices marching in the street, waving different flags, representing Australia in different ways. And the big questions of politics and culture being conflicted and contrasted live in these texts that I consume, and I make meaning of it, and it becomes part of my personal identity. Questions of my personal identity come up. So interesting stuff for you to take on as students of literature, and it's where it becomes real. This is why IB wants us to look at these big concepts, look at the big fields of inquiry, and not just look at the text on its own. That's why Persepolis isn't just Margie's childhood memoir. It's a reflection of how identity, culture, and representation collide whenever power and politics try to control who we are. and hopefully my little spiel about Australia and my own personal reflections show you how not just literary but also non-literary texts can really have an impact because they deal with big concepts such as identity, representation, and transformation, and they kind of deal with them all at the same time. And they also deal with big fields of inquiry such as values and beliefs and power and politics. And they also are doing it in a very clever way. They are works of art that communicate creatively in order to make us think and feel something and react. That's the overall commentary that I would show my class, saying this is how it comes together. I know we talk about a lot in class, and it seems like how do you put it all together? Hopefully, that is going to show you that it can be done, and hopefully, over the next year and a half, as we get towards the big end exams, you can start to see that you are using all these things to become very sophisticated in your analysis of literary and non-literary text. But that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.